What if fear itself was older than the gods, and the first thing Olympus learned was not how to rule, but how to tremble? We are told that the gods were untouchable, seated on their golden thrones, unchallenged in their dominion. Yet beneath the polished verses of poets lies another current, one so unsettling it was buried, rewritten, and chained in shadows. These were not bedtime monsters or allegories for storms. They were inevitabilities. They were the fractures that cracked divine certainty. Before Zeus hurled his thunderbolt, before temples rose to sanctify order, something else stalked the earth, right primal, uncontainable. The Greeks did not imagine monsters for entertainment. They recorded warnings, fragments of terror that even immortals could not silence. Medusa, Cyclopes, the giants, the hundred-handed ones, and Typhon, each was more than a nightmare. Each was a wound in the mask of Olympus, a mirror in which the gods saw their own weakness staring back. These were not tales of victory, but of survival, scars rewritten as triumphs. When in truth, the divine order nearly collapsed. What if the monsters of myth were not villains at all, but the truths the gods could not kill? What if their stories survived not to glorify Olympus, but to whisper of what even immortality fears? Tonight we descend into that abyss, into the 5 demons the gods themselves tried to erase. Before Olympus crowned itself as the summit of order, before Zeus thundered across the sky and Poseidon carved his throne beneath the waves, the world was not serene, not structured, not divine. It was untamed, a theater of forces without sympathy, a chaos that breathed through mountains and oceans, through wounds in the earth and storms in the sky. The Greeks did not imagine their cosmos beginning with perfection. They knew it began with rupture, with violence, with primal energies that no god could truly master. To call these forces monsters is already to speak the language of Olympus. For they were not monsters to the soil that birthed them, nor to the abyss that embraced them. They were inevitabilities clothed in flesh, catastrophes that walked like kings, storms given faces, extinction given breath. This is the true architecture of evil, not an empire of villains, but a network of consequences, a pattern that emerges whenever power overreaches. The gods themselves, for all their immortality, understood that they were not the first rulers, nor would they be the last. They inherited a stage already soaked in blood and rage. They claimed order, not because they deserved it, but because they seized it. And the very tools that made them sovereign were borrowed, stolen, or bargained from the very entities they feared. Lightning bolts forged by chained Cyclopes, victories purchased with mortal blood, thrones secured by unleashing the hundred-handed ones. Every cornerstone of Olympus was cemented with fear. Medusa embodied this fear in its most intimate form. She was not a beast stalking the wilderness, but a reflection forced upon the gods. Survivor whose gaze petrified not because of magic alone, but because it revealed divine guilt. To see her was to be frozen, to witness the crime that Olympus tried to bury, to feel consequence burn through illusion. Cyclopes were no jesters of one-eyed deformity, but forgers of supremacy. The architects who birthed weapons that could unmake gods as easily as they empowered them. Their very existence whispered a secret Olympus never wanted to face, that their strength came not from heaven, but from the abyss, from the hands of those they despised and chained. The giants born from the mutilated blood of Uranus, spilling into Gaia's soil, were not aberrations, but the earth's retaliation, nature answering divine arrogance with bodies sculpted for war. Their immunity to divine death was not a quirk of myth, it was the cosmic declaration that even the gods have limits, that no system of power is invulnerable, and that every regime must one day confront what it cannot kill. The hundred-handed ones were terror incarnate, not because they were evil, but because they embodied chaos unfiltered. The muscle of earth itself, each arm a storm, each roar a quake. The gods did not defeat them, they unleashed them, used them, and buried them again. As all regimes bury the very weapons that once saved them, but now remind them of their dependence. And Typhon, last and greatest, was not just a foe, but the abyss rising to reclaim what Olympus had stolen. Taller than mountains, crowned with 100 serpent heads, his breath a storm that ripped the heavens apart, he nearly erased the divine order altogether. Even Zeus, master of thunder, was humbled, mutilated. and only through desperate bargains and ruthless lightning was Typhon buried beneath Etna, his fury still rumbling in volcanic fire. To weave these beings into the language of monsters is to misunderstand their role. They were never random nightmares. They were deliberate responses, the balancing weights on the scales of cosmos. Medusa punished divine cruelty. The Cyclopes exposed divine theft. The giants revealed divine vulnerability. The hundred-handed ones embodied divine dependence. Typhon incarnated divine mortality. They were the architecture of evil not because they were chaos unchained, but because they revealed the true fear of Olympus, that its order was built on lies, it's on violence, on concealment, and that one eruption, one mirror, one unbound storm could bring it all crashing down. The Greeks, more honest than we, did not flinch from writing these warnings into their myths. They knew that every throne is temporary, every empire fragile, every ruler haunted by what he has buried. And so they sang of gods, yes, but they also whispered of demons. For in those demons lay the map of consequence, the diagram of collapse. The architecture of evil is not a fortress. It is a mirror, and every god who gazed upon it saw not a beast but their own reflection twisted back at them. A reminder that fear does not bow to crowns, and chaos does not pray at temples. This is where our descent begins, with the architecture of evil. With the realization that even the gods built their thrones on bones they could never truly silence. To understand the 5 demons is not to catalog nightmares. It is to trace the fault lines that still run beneath every system of power. Symbols are not decorations. They are weapons, codes, technologies of the unseen. Every empire, every order, every god has survived not only by force of arms, but by force of symbols. The sigils that rewrite perception, that embed power into the human mind. The Greeks knew this instinctively, which is why their myths are threaded not only with thrones and battles, but with images that paralyze, forms that cannot be forgotten. To call Medusa, the Cyclopes, or any of these beings mere monsters, is to strip them of their symbolic role. To reduce a ritual into entertainment. But once you return them to their primal meaning, you see them as living glyphs. Symbols etched into the cosmic script to remind gods and mortals alike that fear is the truest language of power. Take Medusa. Her face is not merely horrific. Her serpents, her petrifying gaze, her exile, they operate as a sigil, a symbol of consequence drawn in flesh. Before her, the gods stood guilty. After her, they stood frozen. To gaze at her was not to witness ugliness, but to see truth sharpened into weapon. Her story is ritualized suppression, victim transformed into monster, beauty inverted into terror. Yet what endures is the symbol Medusa's mirror. That is why, even severed, her head retained its potency, used again and again to turn enemies into stone. The Greeks understood that the symbol once born cannot be killed, that the head of Medusa is not a relic, but an ongoing curse against denial. To this day, her face, carved into temples and shields, still radiates the same power. Consequence petrified into eternal warning. And then the Cyclopes. Misremembered as brutish, one-eyed caricatures, their true mythological form is closer to Smiths of reality. The single eye is not deformity, it is focus, the lens through which raw chaos is forged into weapon. When Zeus hurled his thunderbolt, it was not merely lightning, it was the crystallization of Cyclopean fire, a symbol of supremacy stolen from the abyss. The trident of Poseidon, the helmet of Hades, all instruments that carried not just physical might, but symbolic dominion. A god with lightning is not just destructive, he is untouchable, radiating the aura of inevitability. This is the true gift of the Cyclopes. They did not give Olympus tools, they gave it symbols, icons of terror and control. Yet embedded in that gift is the paradox that haunted Olympus forever. If these creators of power forged the weapons once, they could forge them again, perhaps against their divine masters. Thus every thunderbolt became a symbol not of Zeus's divinity, but of his dependence, his stolen inheritance, his borrowed fear. Symbols are doubled. They carry meaning forward, even when stripped of context. Medusa's severed head still petrifies. Cyclopean weapons still shatter mountains. The gods may claim ownership, but the symbols whisper their origin. And what terrifies power most is not the weapon itself, but the memory inscribed within it that the divine order was not born whole, but built upon the very things it condemned. Look around you, and the pattern persists. Corporations today cloak themselves in logos, flags, emblems that function exactly as ancient sigils did. Condensation of authority into an image. You see a brand and feel compelled. Hear an anthem and feel bound. This is not coincidence. The Greeks encoded the truth. Symbols are spiritual technologies, and whoever commands them commands the imagination. Olympus knew this, which is why it turned monsters into myths, truth into allegory, fear into bedtime story. If they could rename the demon, they could disarm it. If they could turn Medusa into a villain rather than a victim, they could erase the mirror she held to their cruelty. If they could reduce the Cyclopes to comic brutes, they could disguise the fact that their own thrones rested on Cyclopean fire. But symbols cannot be erased. They survive in fragments, in stone carvings, in whispered myths. In the unease you feel when you look at a Gorgon's face, even in art, that unease is the echo of the original ritual, the power that was never extinguished. The language of symbols is not dead. It is immortal because it speaks directly to the subconscious, bypassing reason, embedding fear and awe into the marrow. In this way, Medusa and the Cyclopes are more than stories, they are sigils etched into the mythic architecture of the world. One shows the unbearable truth of consequence, the other, the dangerous origin of power. Together, they remind us that symbols are not innocent. They are chosen, forged, weaponized. And every time Olympus claimed victory, it was these symbols, not divine justice, that secured the illusion of authority. When you see a god holding thunder, you are not looking at the triumph of Olympus. We're looking at the mark of Cyclopean chains, the scar of borrowed power. When you hear the myth of Medusa told as cautionary tale, you are not hearing the truth, you are hearing the god's propaganda. An edited sigil meant to keep you from seeing the mirror behind the monster. That is the language of symbols. It is not what is said, but what is buried in the saying. And once you learn to read it, mythology ceases to be myth, it becomes revelation. Blood is older than gold, older than thrones, older than crowns hammered from stolen fire. Long before mortals minted coins, long before priests measured offerings, blood was the first price of power. Every mythology remembers it, but the Greeks carved it into their stories with an honesty that still unsettles. When the gods fought, when the earth retaliated, when monsters rose from shadows, it was always blood that opened the gates. Not abstract virtue, not divine decree, but the crimson stain that binds sacrifice to consequence. And nowhere is this clearer than in the myths of the giants and the hundred-handed ones. Beings who were not simply born, they were purchased with blood, consequences incarnate. The giants emerged not from divine will, but from mutilation. When Cronus castrated his father Uranus, blood spilled into the soil, and Gaia drank it in. From that union of pain and rage came the giants, colossal beings, whose serpent legs and brutal strength embodied vengeance itself. They were not accidents or receipts, proof written in flesh that no act of violence disappears. The gods tried to crown their victory over the Titans as order restored, but Gaia's children rose to remind them that every throne rests on wounds. What made the giants terrifying was not merely their size, but their immunity. Immortals could not kill them, only mortal hands could bring them down. This loophole was not a weakness in the story, but a signature of bloodless logic that the divine order could never seal itself completely. It always needed the suffering of the vulnerable to secure its reign. Thus Hercules, half-mortal, was summoned. His labors were soaked in blood, his life one long ritual of sacrifice. And the gods, desperate, conscripted him into their war. Olympus survived, not by its own might, but by spilling mortal blood in its defense. This is the oldest contract. Blood offered, power secured, but it never comes without cost. The Gigantomachy was not a clean victory. It was a debt written in crimson across Olympus's marble. Each giant slain was not conquest but consequence, a reminder that the gods could not stand alone. They owed their survival to Hercules, to mortal fragility, to the very thing they claimed to rule above. Blood forced them to admit dependence. And then came the Hecatoncheires, the hundred-handed ones, born of the same union of Gaia and Uranus. Their very bodies were abominations to divine order 50 heads. 100 arms, each appendage capable of hurling mountains. Uranus, horrified, cast them into Tartarus, sealing them in the abyss, hoping blood-borne chaos could be locked away. But chaos waits. When Zeus fought the Titans and Olympus tottered on the edge of defeat, he did what his father had refused. He opened the abyss. He slew the dragon who guarded the pit and freed the 100-handed ones, not out of compassion, but necessity. And when they rose, battlefields ended. Mountains shattered like pottery. Titans fell not before divine wisdom, but before a storm of arms pounding the earth into submission. In truth, it was a pact written in blood. By freeing the Hecatoncheires, Zeus admitted that Olympus could not win without unleashing what it most feared. Power purchased with blood is never pure, it is haunted. That is why once the war was over, the gods did not celebrate the 100-handed ones. They buried them again, made them jailers of Tartarus, hidden away so no one would remember that Olympus rose on their backs. But blood does not forget. Every mountain, every quake, every echo in the earth is a reminder that the raw strength of chaos still pulses beneath the surface, unpaid and unpraised. This is the pattern. Mutilation births monsters, suppression breeds rebellion, blood spilled demands repayment. The giants and the Hecatoncheires are not aberrations, they are balance. They are proof that power cannot erase its debts. The gods bled the sky and the earth answered. They chained their children, and the abyss grew restless. They claimed divine right, and mortality itself was conscripted as currency. Every victory was bought with blood, and every drop carried interest. Look deeper, and you see the same architecture in human systems. Empires demand sacrifice. Soldiers sent to war, workers drained of life for profit, the powerless paying with suffering, so the powerful can call themselves untouchable. Blood may no longer flow on altars, but the metaphor remains. Every system of control runs on sacrifice, whether it is flesh, time, or spirit. The Greeks encoded this truth in their myths, that power is not sustained by virtue, but by the willingness to extract cost to bury dependence beneath marble facades. The giants remind us that blood spilled never disappears, it germinates consequences. The Hecatoncheires remind us that suppressed fury, once unleashed, can topple even the most exalted order. Together, they form the grammar of sacrifice. Bleed, suppress, erupt, repeat. And the gods, despite their divinity, were caught in this cycle. They feared it, they hid it, but they could not escape it. So when you hear the old tales of divine battles, do not imagine gleaming gods triumphing through justice. Imagine spilled blood seeping into the soil, sprouting into giants, rattling the abyss until 100 hands claw their way back to the surface. Imagine thrones built not on justice but on debt, every marble column trembling because it rests on bones unacknowledged. Blood was the first currency, and it remains the most honest. Because every act of power still demands payment, and the bill is always written in red. Power is never given freely. It is always negotiated, bargained, and sealed not in ink, but in blood and fire and vows whispered into the abyss. Olympus was no exception. For all their posturing as eternal rulers, the gods owed their survival to pacts as dark and binding as any contract signed in shadow. And no myth embodies this better than Typhon, the last and greatest of Gaia's children, born not merely as a beast but as a covenant, a cosmic contract of vengeance between Earth and the abyss itself. Gaia had suffered long, had watched Uranus mutilated, her children buried, the Titans overthrown, the giants slaughtered. She had endured the weight of divine arrogance pressed upon her soil, the blood of betrayal soaking into her veins. So she sought a partner, not among the gods or mortals, but in Tartarus. The abyss personified, the yawning pit that swallowed all suppressed power. Their union was not love, but pact. Gaia would provide fury. Tartarus would provide chaos. And together, they would birth a being that no god could tame. Thus Typhon came into the world, not as accident, but as contract fulfilled. A living clause in the agreement that no divine order could last without challenge. Typhon was extinction incarnate, his arms stretching across the horizon. His head crowned with 100 serpents, his eyes burning storms into the sky. When he arose, Olympus did not rally to face him, they fled. Poseidon sank into the sea, Apollo disguised himself, Hera vanished into fear. Even Ares, god of war, deserted the battlefield. Only Zeus remained, and even he faltered. In the first clash, Typhon overwhelmed him, stripped him of sinew, bound him, cast him into a cave. For a moment, the contract held firm. Olympus humbled, trembling, undone. But contracts are slippery. Hermes and Pan, tricksters of cunning, found a way to steal back Zeus's tendons, to restore his strength. The pact was broken, not through honor, but through theft. When Zeus returned, his vengeance was not noble. It was desperate, brutal, contractual in its own right. He hurled lightning until Typhon burned, until his body was buried beneath Mount Etna. His breath erupting as fire, his rage shuddering in every tremor. Yet burial is not erasure. The contract remains active, its terms carved into the trembling earth. Every eruption a reminder, every plume of smoke a clause yet unpaid. Typhon was not defeated, only contained, and containment is the language of contracts that terrify their signers. This is the truth Olympus concealed. Every god was bound, not by loyalty or morality, but by agreements forged under duress. They struck bargains with Cyclopes to gain weapons, with mortals to win wars, with chaos itself to secure survival. These pacts were always transactional, always conditional, always carrying the risk of reversal. The gods were not absolute monarchs but debtors, their thrones mortgaged to forces they could not fully control. The myth of Typhon reveals the nature of all contracts of power. They begin in imbalance, in betrayal, in wounds too deep to heal. They promise stability but bind both sides in chains. Gaia's pact with Tartarus birthed Typhon, but it also bound her rage into a form that could be struck down. Zeus's pact with the Cyclopes armed him with thunderbolts, but it tied his legitimacy to gifts he did not create. His pact with Hercules won him victory over the giants, but it revealed dependence on mortals he claimed to rule. Each contract gave Olympus survival, but at the cost of autonomy. And here lies the paradox. The gods feared not chaos itself, but the contracts they could not escape. Every pact left a scar. Every contract whispered of limits. Even the thunderbolt in Zeus's hand, symbol of supreme authority, was a reminder that his power was borrowed, contingent, revocable. That is the terror of contracts. They bind not only the weak, but the strong, and in binding, they expose fragility. Look to the world around you, and the pattern repeats. Modern contract debts, labor agreements, treaties are secular descendants of these cosmic bargains. They promise protection, survival, power, but they bind the signer into cycles of dependency. A loan transforms into a chain. A job contract becomes a pact of energy traded for time, spirit for wages. Nations sign treaties that preserve peace while tethering them to perpetual war readiness. Contracts are rituals of power disguised as agreements, and like the myths of Olympus, they are always written to favor those who hold the pen. Typhon's story is not just myth, it is allegory. He represents the ultimate consequence of broken contracts, the abyss rising to collect its debt. He is the clause that Olympus tried to redact, the signature Gaia forced onto divine history, and though buried, he is never gone. Every eruption of Etna is a reminder that pacts do not vanish when ignored. They linger, smolder, wait. The gods taught us this in their fear, that every system built on suppressed voices, stolen power, or unpaid debt will one day face its Typhon. So when you hear of contracts, whether divine or mundane, remember what they are: bindings written in sacrifice, bargains struck in desperation, promises shadowed by threat. The gods may call them victories, but the volcano still burns. Olympus may wear crowns, but beneath its marble is parchment written in blood. And Typhon, the living contract, waits for the day when the debt comes due. Mythology is always written by the victors, and the victors always tell the same story. We were righteous, they were evil. We brought order, they brought chaos. But what if the script was reversed? What if the so-called monsters were not villains at all, but mirrors held up to divine arrogance? The Greeks, in their earliest and rawest tales, hinted at this inversion, though later poets and priests worked tirelessly to smooth it away. To read these myths honestly is to walk into an inverted moral code, where the gods are tyrants. The monsters are truth, and evil is only what the powerful fear. Consider Medusa. Her story is almost always framed as curse. Beauty transformed into horror, a warning to women who defy the gods. Yet peel back the later layers, and the truth sharpens into focus. Medusa was punished not for wickedness, but for surviving divine violence. Her serpents were not blemishes but weapons, her gaze not malice but consequence. To look at her was to see divine guilt incarnate, to be frozen by the unbearable truth that even gods commit crimes they cannot erase. Inverted morality means that the monster is not evil, it is justice in a form too raw for Olympus to endure. The Cyclopes, too, were recast. Later myths mocked them as bumbling brutes, caricatures of stupidity. But in the older cosmogonies, they were the forgers of divine supremacy. The craftsmen who placed thunder in Zeus's hand and trident in Poseidon's grasp. The gods painted them as abominations, chained them in Tartarus, then claimed their creations as divine birthright. The inversion is clear. The supposed monsters were creators, while the gods were plagiarists. The moral order, as sung in hymns, was propaganda. The truth was dependency, disguised as dominance. And what of the giants? Their uprising was never random violence. They were born from blood spilled in betrayal, from Gaia's rage at the mutilation of Uranus, from the arrogance of gods who crowned themselves rulers without consequence. To call them monsters is to erase their role as balance, as retaliation written in flesh. They were not embodiments of chaos, but of justice, demanding repayment for wounds ignored. The gods feared them not because they were wicked, but because they revealed divine mortality, the limits of power. The inversion strikes again. Rebellion is righteousness. Order is tyranny. The hundred-handed ones embody the same paradox. Uranus cast them into Tartarus for their grotesque form, declaring them abominations unworthy of light. But when Zeus needed victory, he freed them and rode their chaos to triumph. Without them, Olympus would never have risen. Yet afterward, they were buried again, hidden as shameful allies. Monsters when inconvenient, saviors when necessary. This is the moral gymnastics of divinity. The gods wrote the laws, then broke them whenever survival required. And when the dust settled, they recast themselves as heroes and their indispensable allies, as nightmares unfit for memory. Inversion upon inversion, until the truth was indistinguishable from the lie. Finally, Typhon, even Zeus, master of thunder, trembled before him. In the sanitized versions, Typhon is pure evil, chaos incarnate, a beast slain to secure cosmic order. But the older stories tell something darker. Zeus was nearly destroyed. Mutilated, bound, his victory stolen back only through trickery and overwhelming violence. Typhon was not a random eruption of chaos. It was Gaia's final word, the abyss's rightful claim, the debt come due. To call him evil is to mask Olympus's terror, the one force they could not assimilate. In truth, Typhon was necessary, the living reminder that no throne is eternal, no system absolute. He was not wickedness, but correction, the counterforce that ensured the gods never forgot their borrowed power. This is the inverted moral code. The monsters are not villains, but inevitabilities. The gods not protectors, but usurpers. The Greeks knew this. That is why their oldest myths are messy, contradictory, fragmented. Later poets cleaned them, smoothing chaos into morality plays. But in the raw versions, you see the jagged edge of truth. Every so-called demon is a mirror. Every monster a wound, every uprising a consequence. The gods may sit on thrones, but their authority is not justice. It's survival rewritten as destiny. The inversion matters because it reveals the logic of power. Systems always demonize what they cannot control. They cast rebels as threats, survivors as curses, creators as abominations. They turn balance into chaos, and consequence into villainy. This is not only mythology, it is every society, every empire, every regime. The labels change, but the mechanism is the same. Monsters are born when truth refuses to submit. And if you listen closely, you realize this is not just about Olympus. It is about us. The same inverted moral code still governs the world. Institutions punish whistleblowers as traitors. Cultures shame defiance as arrogance. Systems vilify the very forces that expose their weaknesses. Just as the gods called Medusa cursed, modern orders call rage unhealthy, rebellion dangerous, individuality selfish. The language shifts, but the intent is the same: to make you fear the part of yourself that cannot be domesticated. That is why these myths endure. They are not cautionary tales about monsters. They are warnings about gods. They whisper that power is always afraid of what it calls evil, because that evil is simply the truth it cannot contain. Inverting the code is not blasphemy, it is clarity. It is recognizing that what you were told to fear might be what saves you, and what you were told to worship might be what enslaves you. And so the question hangs. When you look at these myths, when you see Medusa's gaze, the Cyclopes' forge, the giant's uprising, the hundred-handed one's storm and Typhon's fire, who do you call monstrous? Them or the gods who buried them? Rituals are not confined to temples. They're not limited to blood spilled on stone altars or incense rising before statues. Rituals are the engines of reality, the hidden scripts through which power sustains itself. The Greeks knew this, though they disguised it beneath the poetry of myth. Every story of gods and demons is a ritual disguised as narrative, a reenactment of cosmic order repeated so often that it becomes law. And once you see this, you realize that Olympus itself was a theater, a temple without walls, where ritual was not performed occasionally but endlessly. In every battle, every curse, every suppression, take the burying of the Hecatoncheires. To cast the hundred-handed ones into Tartarus was not simply punishment, it was ritual containment. The gods needed the act of burying to be seen, to be told, to be remembered, so that the lesson would echo. Chaos is chained, order is secure. But the truth is that the very act of burying was acknowledgement of fear. Rituals always betray the anxieties of the powerful. If Zeus truly ruled unchallenged, why seal away his allies after victory? Because ritual erases dependence. By casting them into the abyss again, Olympus rewrote memory into myth. We triumphed alone. The same pattern holds in the myth of Medusa. Her transformation by Athena was ritual sacrifice, a symbolic killing of the victim disguised as divine justice. Turning beauty into horror was a ritual inversion, a way of encoding the message. Resistance becomes curse. But the ritual backfired, for Medusa's head itself became a ritual object. Carried into battle, placed on shields, etched into temples. Her severed face turned from curse to talisman, a symbol used to petrify enemies, to strike fear. This is ritual cannibalism, the gods taking what they feared, weaponizing it, and using it as a performance of dominance. Every time Perseus raised the head, it was not just combated, it was liturgy, reenacting the lie that the gods controlled consequence. Yet, even in their control, the truth leaked. The head still terrified because it remembered the crime. The Cyclopes' forge, too, was ritual. They did not simply hammer metal, they inscribed authority. The thunderbolt, the trident, the helmet of invisibilities were not just weapons, but ritual artifacts. Every time Zeus hurled lightning, it was not only destruction, but affirmation. The symbol is ours. Fear belongs to Olympus. The gods repeated this ritual endlessly, storm after storm, till mortals forgot that the lightning was borrowed, that it was Cyclopean fire tamed by chains. Ritual is repetition until memory erodes. And what of the giants? Their uprising was a ritual of balance, a ceremony of blood rising from soil to confront thrones built on betrayal. The Gigantomachy was remembered not as rebellion, but as divine triumph. A ritual drama retold to reinforce the message: order always wins. Yet within the cracks of the story you hear the other ritual, the earth demanding repayment, blood answering blood, consequence refusing erasure. That is the double edge of ritual. What it intends to suppress often resurfaces in the very act of performance. Typhon is perhaps the clearest example. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was retold endlessly, performed in hymns, etched in mosaics, invoked in festivals. Every telling was ritual reinforcement. Chaos was defeated, order preserved, Olympus eternal. Yet the earth itself undermined the script. Mount Etna erupted, spewing fire and ash, and mortals whispered, Typhon still breathes. Every eruption was counter-ritual, the abyss reminding the world that no burial is absolute, no ritual erases reality. The gods performed victory, but the volcano performed truth. And the truth was that rituals are only ever temporary cages. This is why rituals are everywhere. They are not relics of religion. They're the architecture of every system. Nations today open sessions with anthems. Brands stamp their logos across products. Corporations demand oaths of loyalty in the form of contracts. These are not accidents. They are rituals. When you stand for a flag, you are repeating the same performance as mortals who watched Zeus throw lightning. When you see a logo and feel awe or desire, you are responding to a sigil, no different from a Gorgon's head. When laws demand signatures in ink, they are binding you with the same contract logic that buried Typhon. Rituals never died, they evolved, disguised themselves as tradition, as culture, as necessity. And like the rituals of Olympus, they are built on fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of chaos, fear of mortality. That is why they repeat endlessly, because repetition is the only way to keep fear hidden, to make the illusion seem natural. The gods knew that to control mortals, they had to perform order again and again, burying monsters, silencing survivors, weaponizing creation. Modern powers know the same truth. Ritual is the engine that keeps systems from collapsing under the weight of their lies. The inverted code you saw in the last part where monsters were justice, and gods were tyrants' lives inside these rituals. Every anthem hides fear of silence. Every brand hides fear of irrelevance. Every contract hides fear of dependence. Just as the gods buried their monsters, modern systems bury their truths beneath rituals of repetition. But the cracks show. A volcano erupts. A whistleblower speaks. Forgotten myth whispers through stone. And in that moment, the ritual trembles. The Greeks understood this. That is why their myths were never just stories. They were rituals encoded in narrative, ceremonies of power disguised as legends. To listen to them is not to hear entertainment, but to attend a liturgy sometimes of domination, sometimes of rebellion, always of fear. And to recognize this is to awaken to the fact that you are surrounded by rituals still. They are everywhere, structuring your days, shaping your fears, writing your role. The only question is whether you continue to perform them unconsciously, or whether you dare to interrupt the script. There comes a moment when the mask slips, when the ritual no longer conceals its intent. For the Greeks, that moment was encoded in the myths of their demons: Medusa, Cyclopes, giants, hundred-handed ones, Typhon. For us, it arrives when we realize that these myths are not ancient curiosities, but mirrors held up to the present. Awakening is not about learning new stories. It is about recognizing that the stories never ended. They became the world around you. What do the myths say? They whisper that power is always afraid of what it cannot control. The gods called these beings monsters not because they were evil, but because they refused to submit. Medusa embodied consequence, turning divine cruelty back upon itself. The Cyclopes embodied creation, revealing that Olympus stole its thunder from the abyss. The giants embodied retaliation, the earth itself answering betrayal with uprising. The hundred-handed ones embodied inevitability, the raw force that no hierarchy could domesticate. Typhon embodied reckoning, the claws of reality that no ritual could erase. Each one revealed the cracks in divine order, and the gods responded with the same strategy every regime uses. Bury it, rewrite it, label it monstrous. Awakening begins when you see the same strategy unfolding around you. Modern systems tell you what to fear: anger, defiance, voices that refuse silence. They tell you what to worship: order, obedience, crowns disguised as credentials, thunderbolts disguised as laws. They shame the Medusa within you, teaching you to call survival ugly. They mock the Cyclopean eye of focus, calling it obsession or madness. They punish the uprising of the giants in protests, rebellions, or even private refusals. They exile the hundred-handed strength of collective fury, dispersing it into isolation. And they bury the Typhon within the abyssal fire that laughs at their thrones, teaching you to fear your own storm. These are not accidents. They are rituals of suppression, carried forward from Olympus into every empire, every institution. But awakening is dangerous because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Begin to recognize that fear is mislabeled power. The traits you were taught to suppress rage, refusal, untamable energy are the very forces that systems fear most. To call them flaws is a lie. They are sacred inheritances, the fragments of the same primal forces that once humbled gods. Awakening is reclaiming these fragments, not as curses but as truths. To gaze with Medusa's eyes is to petrify the lies you've been fed. To forge with the Cyclopes is to create power from the abyss of your own experience. To rise as a giant is to embody consequence, to remind power that it cannot wound without payment. To unleash the 100 hands is to stop fighting as an individual and roar as a chorus. And to awaken Typhon is to recognize that within you lies the storm that no ritual can bury. This realization is terrifying, which is why most turn away. Systems rely on your willingness to remain asleep, to perform the rituals without question, to accept the inverted moral code as truth. Awakening is rebellion not just against gods or rulers, but against the script itself. It means admitting that the monsters were never outside you, they were always inside, waiting. And once they rise, you will never fit back into the cage they built. That is why every culture warns against monsters, not because they threaten the world, but because they threaten the illusion. The Greeks encoded this warning not as entertainment, but as survival. They knew that systems of power always collapse from within, always undone by the forces they bury. They knew that fear is cyclical. The more you suppress it, the stronger it grows. They knew that every Typhon erupts eventually, every Medusa petrifies the liar, every giant rises to shake the throne. Their myths were not stories to lull children, but maps to awaken adults. Rituals of recognition disguised as fables. And so the question comes to you, what have you buried? What part of you did the system teach you to call monstrous? What strength lies chained in your Tartarus? What voice silenced? What fire smothered? Awakening is not about becoming something new. It is about unearthing what you were always taught to hide. It is about realizing that you were the ritual all along, that your obedience fed the system. Your silence sealed its thrones. Your fear gave it power. And the moment you stop, the moment you awaken, the ritual breaks. This is why the gods feared their demons, not because they were beasts of chaos, but because they were truths in flesh. This is why modern powers fear awakened individuals. It's not because you are dangerous in the sense they claim, but because once you awaken, you cannot be controlled, cannot be pacified, cannot be turned into a product or a follower. You are no longer predictable, and unpredictability is the death of every empire. Awakening is not safe. We'll strip illusions, burn hierarchies, crack thrones, will demand sacrifice, just as the myths always did. But it is also freedom, the kind of freedom that terrifies order because it does not ask permission, does not bow to crowns, does not wait for blessing. It erupts like Typhon, stares like Medusa, hammers like the Cyclopes, roars like the 100 hands, and shakes the earth like the giants. It is not chaos for chaos's sake. It is balance. It is truth. The Greeks left us the blueprint. The demons they feared are the same forces buried in you. The only question is whether you keep performing the rituals that suppress them, or whether you finally let them rise. The gods buried their fear, but you cannot bury truth forever. These myths are not relics, they're signals, reminders that what you were taught to fear may be the power you most need. If this descent stirred something within you, comment, share, and subscribe. Our next ritual begins soon.